The Manfred Vogel Memorial Lecture was endowed now almost 15 years ago to honor Professor Manfred Vogel, who over the course of more than 40 years was a founder and really a pillar of academic Jewish studies here at Northwestern. He was the faculty member who really saw this vision of bringing Jewish studies to the university through in its earliest stage, and trained numerous students, many of whom are now professors, or even some of them retired professors, who have taught and strengthened the field of Jewish studies at other universities, including, for those of you who know, Professor Ken Sieskin, recently retired from Northwestern. He was a student of Professor Vogel. And so somebody who all of us here in some form or another really owe a debt of gratitude to. Professor Vogel, already in the 1960s, when he began his career, was trying to take his study of Jewish, in his case, Jewish theology, Judaism, the religion, the academic study of those fields, and to bring them into conversation, broader conversation, with trends in the academy, in the humanities, in the social sciences, to try to show people that it's not just in the synagogue, it's not just in the yeshiva, it's not just Jews who need to study Jewish studies, that there's something there that's important, that it speaks to conversations that are important for all of us here on campus and even beyond. For many years, to honor his legacy, we've brought other theologians, scholars of Judaism as a religion, but over the last few years, we've been pivoting a little bit to try to find speakers and scholars whose research really speaks directly to those kinds of crossover issues, the kinds of questions that are important in the humanities, that are important for the university campus, that are important for the Jewish community, and that academic scholars of Jewish studies have something unique and significant to contribute to. And so this is a long-winded way of saying that this is the perfect time to welcome really the perfect speaker for this series, Professor Ethan Katz. Professor Katz is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Berkeley. He's also the Helen Diller Family Faculty Director of Berkeley's Center for Jewish Studies. And when you hear some of the work that he has done and the work that he's doing, I think you'll begin to sense why his is a voice that's particularly important right now. So his research focuses on Jewish-Muslim relations, Jews in colonial societies, Holocaust studies, and the interplay between religious and secular in modern Jewish life. His first monograph, which was published by Harvard University Press about a decade ago, is called The Burdens of Brotherhood, Jews and Muslims from North Africa to France. It won a slew of prizes. I'm not going to read all of them because it would take too much time. He has recently been working on not one but two books, the first of which seems like it's going to be the one that's going to come out later, although he'll correct me if I'm wrong about this, is tentatively called Midnight in Algiers, Jews, the French Empire, and the Unholy Alliance that helped win World War II. And I got to read a little blurb online about what this project is focusing on, and the title seems like it is right on the mark in terms of the sort of gripping and engaging nature. But he's also working on a project that we're going to hear much more about tonight, and that's called Unsettling: Histories, Jews, Colonialism, and Zionism. And these issues, Jewish-Muslim relations, anti-Semitism, colonialism and post-colonialism, the way that all these things sort of function in modern Jewish society, these are the topics that are in the headlines. These are the topics that people really all over the country and all over the world are talking about and thinking about, and to have an academic voice to shed light on them is a really valuable opportunity for all of us. Much more that I could say about him, but enough from me. I'll turn it over instead to Professor Ethan Katz.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you to David for that outrageously kind introduction. I'm afraid it's all downhill from there. I'm really honored to be invited to give the Manfred H. Vogel Lecture in Jewish Studies here, and very much appreciate all of the work by David, by Nancy Gelman, by the staff of the center. These events, as I know, intimately do not just appear out of thin air. They require a lot of legwork, and I really appreciate all of that. I will speak closer to the mic, I'm sorry. For the past year and a half, American campuses and streets have frequently been the site of fierce battles over Israel and Palestine, Zionism and anti-Zionism. Since January of 2025, the federal government has launched a series of actions in the name of combating anti-Semitism that many perceive as a fundamental attack on American higher education. In this talk, I want to take us beneath the surface of these struggles to examine their deeper roots And in particular, I want to look at three broader, more long-standing problems. The first problem concerns the connection, or the lack thereof, between Zionism and colonialism. The second is about the linkages and differences between the position, interests, and rights of Jews and those of other historically marginalized groups. The third involves the interrelationship, overlap, or dissonance between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. In this talk and in a book and essay that I'm currently completing, for shorthand purposes, I call these problems Zionism and colonialism, Jews and other others, and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Typically, we think about and articulate each of these problems in the zero-sum terms of polemics. On the matter of Zionism and colonialism, Israel's most vocal defenders tend to argue that the first, Zionism, has nothing to do with the second, colonialism, since the former is a story of self-realization, repatriation, and liberation by Europe's greatest victims, Jews, and their brethren exiled from the Arab world. And the second is one of European conquest, subjugation, and oppression. Israel's fiercest critics, by contrast, see Zionism as simply a late form of European colonialism. They equate Zionism with conquest, racial apartheid, and even genocide against a Middle Eastern people, Palestinian Arabs, by another people they deem European, Jewish Israelis. For the second issue, Jews and other others, on one side, many have come to see Jews as more or less privileged and powerful, far removed from any situation of victimhood, discrimination, or danger. In this formulation, Jewish rights are altogether separate from, or even possibly opposed to, the rights of those facing systematic disadvantage. On the other side, many of those most concerned about anti-Semitism insist that Jews face levels of exclusion, hatred, and verbal and physical assault that parallel or even exceed those suffered by other marginalized groups, and that the Jewish experience is frequently ignored. On the matter of anti-Zionism's relationship to anti-Semitism, the polarities are just as stark. Many endeavor to draw a bright line between anti-Zionism as fierce or even harsh criticism of Israel or the Zionist project, and anti-Semitism as hatred of Jews. From this vantage point, the two have little or nothing to do with each other. In the opposing camp, many of anti-Zionism's toughest critics treat the phenomenon as coterminous, if not identical, with anti-Semitism, often describing it as the newest form of the world's oldest hatred. With the help of history, we can come to see each of these problems in all of their complexity. Zionism has historically been both an authentic national liberation project and an ideology and set of practices with deeply colonial elements. Beginning in the late 19th century, Zionism was a genuinely revolutionary movement that aimed to enable Jews to reclaim their own destiny and return to their ancient homeland after 2,000 years of exile, longing, wandering, and facing recurrent vulnerability and persecution. Yet in the event, this would only occur through colonization, displacement, and large-scale violence and dispossession against another ethno-national group, Palestinian Arabs, who had long dwelled with equally compelling claims of belonging in the same land. The central episode in this story is known to most Jews as the Israeli War for Independence in 1948, and it is known to most Palestinians as the Nakba, or the catastrophe, the displacement of some 700,000 Palestinians that accompanied Israel's founding. For most Palestinians, the Nakba did not end in 1948, but rather it is everything that has happened since that time, up to and including the horrific death and destruction wrought by the current Israeli military campaign in Gaza. Likewise, for the second issue of Jews and other others, Jews have historically faced regularized, often violent persecution since the dawn of Western civilization and have simultaneously found greater opportunities for upward mobility than many other groups deemed outsiders, or in the ancient formulation, strangers. During the Holocaust and in numerous other times and places, Jews became regarded as the ultimate other, often the heart of interwoven systems of oppression that also marginalized groups like Roma, Muslims, blacks, homosexuals, and women. And yet, in numerous modern nation-states and empires, while typically not direct agents of harm or control, Jews have been regular participants and beneficiaries in systems of power and privilege, making the matter all the more complex in contexts like the racial divides of the United States or the Israel-Palestine conflict. Jews have been simultaneously victims and victimizers. In part, it is the first two dilemmas that help to underscore the third, regarding anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Fierce critique of the Zionist project or the State of Israel has its own history of widely varying relationships to anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism can come to function in its impact, even if not its intent, like anti-Semitism in the tangible harm to Jews it causes in a given context, Or it can employ stereotypes or accusations against Israelis that sound eerily reminiscent of those long used to demonize Jews as holding ultimate power, financial control, or the position of puppeteers. At the same time, many individuals, movements, or ideas to which the label of anti-Zionist has been attached or self-ascribed could hardly be considered anti-Semitic. This is particularly the case for those who critique Israel from a perspective that advances an alternative politics that is specifically Jewish, or one that centers the Palestinian experience. To begin to excavate tools of history needed to reassess these three current debates as complex problems, I want to turn to a thinker who was unusually capable of holding up both sides of these problems and resisting the resort to polemics. The Tunisian-born Franco-Jewish intellectual Albert Memmi, who lived from 1920 to 2020. Memmi was a sociologist, a philosopher, and a novelist. He was a leading anti-colonial theorist and a leading voice on the Jewish condition in the mid to late 20th century, as well as an accomplished author and scholar of Maghrebi literature. For each of the three dilemmas that concern us here, Memmi churned out powerful insights that offer grist for the conversations of our own time. He was among the first thinkers to assess in a sustained manner the position of Jews and that of other historically persecuted groups, particularly victims of colonialism and racism. His most widely read work, focused on the latter, was the classic The Colonizer and the Colonized, published in 1957, a brilliant and piercing indictment of the colonial setting and the self-reinforcing mechanisms that keep the colonizer in a superior position indefinitely, constantly forestalling any possible reform or true equality between the indigenous and the ruling classes. Through his own life, Memmi perceived within the colonial setting of French North Africa how Jews often held a complex position vis-a-vis other marginalized groups. Likewise, he highlighted the constant tensions between the demands of Jewish particularity and universalism. In the English edition of The Colonizer and the Colonized, published in 1965, Memmi raised these issues directly in the preface when he wrote, quote, "Here is a confession I have never made before. I know the colonizer from the inside almost as well as I know the colonized. Like all other native Tunisians, I was treated as a second-class citizen, deprived of political rights, refused admission to most civil service departments, etc. But I was not a Muslim. In a country where so many groups, each jealous of its own physiognomy, lived side by side, this was of considerable importance. Jews were undeniably, quote, natives, as they were then called. However, unlike the Muslims, they passionately endeavored to identify themselves with the French. To them, the West was the paragon of all civilization, all culture. For better or for worse, the Jew found himself one small notch above the Muslim on the pyramid which is the basis of all colonial societies." So for Memmi, Jews had an inherently contradictory relationship to the colonial system, wherein they often benefited from greater privileges than their fellow natives, even as they faced major legal restrictions on their own status, periodic surges of anti-Semitism on the part of European settlers, or eruptions of anti-Jewish violence on the part of other indigenous inhabitants. In his view, despite, or in part because of, such complex positionality, Jews could neither become indifferent to the wider suffering of other victims of oppression on the one hand, nor neglect altogether their specific position as Jews on the other. And here we arrive at Memmi's take on the problem of Zionism and colonialism, which bears the imprint of these same dual considerations. For him, Zionism not only did not contradict decolonization, rather it embodied the decolonizing of Jewish history. Zionism, Memmi claims in his book Jews and Arabs, published in 1974, quote, was also the movement for the national liberation of the Jews, on a par with the other national liberation movements in the Maghreb, in Africa, and elsewhere in the world. Noting that he has, quote, continued to approve of the liberation and the national development of the Arabs, Memmi asks, quote, why should I not wish for the same things for my own people? If that is what being a Zionist means, then I am indeed a Zionist. He put it most succinctly in the preface to the Israeli edition of The Liberation of the Jew in 1976, where he summarized the book's conclusions. The Jew was and basically remains an oppressed person, the object of constant potential threat anywhere in the world. Like all oppressed people, Jews have the right to a specific liberation. The liberation of all peoples, Jews included, has assumed the form of national and social liberation. Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, and the State of Israel is the culmination of Zionism. All other courses of action are ultimately nothing but accommodation with oppression. Similarly, in Jews and Arabs, Memmi argues that Zionism, quote, is the only way for a Jew to contribute to freeing his people collectively, the only way today for a Jew to be progressive as a Jew. In the same work, Memmi rejects wholesale those interpretations describing Israel as a colonial state. Quote, "The Jews and the Arabs, they do not follow the colonizer-colonized model, with the Jews as the colonizers and the Arabs as the colonized." And yet, particularly over time, as the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza persisted and grew more violent, Memmi took a more measured view of the possible relationship between Zionism and colonialism. In the preface to the Hebrew edition of his book Racism, published in 1999, he insisted that, quote, "We cannot boast of having created morality and simultaneously dominate another people." Linking directly the situation in Palestine with the themes of his anti-colonial work, he continued by lamenting, quote, "For this reason, I always regretted that no Israeli publisher agreed to publish any of my writing on these issues, and especially The Colonizer and the Colonized. I am waiting hopefully for it also to be published in Hebrew. It will mean that the Israeli public will see itself finally as deserving to cope with the difficulties of its national existence." So in short, Israel is essential for Memmi as the nation state of the Jewish people, but he is clear-eyed enough to note emphatically that it too has the problems of other national and indeed colonial states. He suggests that Zionists must face the depth of Palestinian suffering that has occurred at the hands of Israel's existence and its policies. This larger perspective on reposing polemics as historical problems and on the specific complexity of Zionism and colonialism and Jews and others provides a crucial foundation for our central matter tonight, the question of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. In thinking about these two phenomena, I think it's crucial to keep in mind three major distinctions. The first is between Zionism as an idea and Zionism as a lived reality. That's really bright. Typically, anti-Zionists focus on one or the other. In the first instance, they oppose or do not accept the core ideological tenet of Zionism, that Jews have the right to collective sovereignty, freedom, safety, and thriving in some part of their ancestral homeland. In the second instance, they oppose the current policies, institutions, and often the entity itself that instantiates that core tenet, the State of Israel. This leads us to the second distinction between what I call critical anti-Zionism versus negationist anti-Zionism. The former is fundamentally about critiquing what is wrong, historically or at present, with the way Zionism as an ideology or set of practices has developed. Critical anti-Zionism endeavors to focus its attacks on a state, Israel, or a political project, Zionist nation building, and to insist that these are not attacks on Jews broadly. Critical anti-Zionism can often take the form of specific critiques and or proposals for fundamentally reshaping the political order in Israel-Palestine. Some of these proposals, even if radical, echo other minority forms of Zionism itself. By contrast, negationist anti-Zionism rejects the legitimacy of the Zionist project altogether, or calls explicitly or by implication for the elimination of the State of Israel or any state that maintains some form of Jewish self-determination in a part of Israel-Palestine. This type of anti-Zionism is often what some scholars call erasive, as it ignores or writes out from history the millennia of Jewish roots in the land of Israel, the long-standing reality of anti-Semitism, and the modern history of Zionism and the State of Israel. In critiquing Israel, negationist anti-Zionism frequently employs anti-Jewish tropes. As illuminated in Derek Penslar's important book on the emotional history of Zionism, these two types of anti-Zionism also occupy rather different emotional registers. Critical anti-Zionism, like many forms of critique, may include fierce anger, but can also be informed by emotions of love and hope toward Israel or Jews. Negationist anti-Zionism is shaped in significant part by hatred of Israel, and all too often of Jews as a collective more broadly. Unlike anger, hatred is an emotion that is less open to evolution or development because it hardens and it leads often to essentialized assessments of the hated group or entity. Indeed, while throughout history and up to the present, critical anti-Zionism has very often not been anti-Semitic, negationist anti-Zionism frequently incorporates anti-Semitism into its worldview. The last distinction that I want to emphasize is that between intention and impact. In many instances, there's a gap between the intentional goals of those most critical of Israel and the effect of their words or actions. Someone or something can be anti-Zionist in intention in a way that is carefully circumscribed, while still having disproportionate impacts upon Jewish students, for instance, because of their Jewishness. At the same time, the position of the speaker or actor is crucial. For instance, the same words or ideas may mean very different things coming from a white nationalist with a history of defamatory remarks about Jews versus a Palestinian whose family fled Israel in 1948. In short, if we want to measure whether a given expression of anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, it's crucial to distinguish between intentions versus impacts. With this terminological groundwork in mind, we can now proceed to a brief history of the strand that I have termed critical anti-Zionism. The primary sites for this type of anti-Zionism have been competing movements in modern Jewish politics and in Palestinian Arab opposition to Zionism. In a sense, there were Jewish anti-Zionists before there were modern Zionists. By the mid-19th century, Jewish reformers and liberal advocates for individual rights for Jews had advocated for decades for what they called emancipation, or equal citizenship for Jews in Western societies, with the clear understanding that one of the prices of equality was the renunciation of any claim to a separate Jewish nationalism or the revival of a separate Jewish state. In 1885, the famous Pittsburgh Platform, drafted by Reform rabbis in the United States, declared emphatically, quote, "We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state." From a different vantage point, most traditional Jewish religious authorities had long taken a dim view of any movement to promote large-scale Jewish migration to Palestine or the establishment of a Jewish polity there, believing that Jewish law prohibited such activity until the time of the coming of the Messiah. In the decades after the Zionist movement's founding, in countries where Jews had attained legal equality and robust levels of social integration, many Jewish leaders spoke openly against Zionism. In 1904, Lucien Wolfe, a British Jewish journalist, diplomat, and activist on behalf of Jewish rights, published an essay called The Zionist Peril, where he called himself, quote, "a convinced and uncompromising anti-Zionist." In addition to lodging numerous critiques against Zionism for its faults, he insisted, quote, "the real Jewish nationalism, the only true Zion, was the prophetic goal of, quote, lofty toleration and universalism." Zionism for Wolfe was a dead-end ideal that would only provoke increased anti-Semitism. Attitudes among many establishment Jews toward Zionism began to soften in the years following the 1917 Balfour Declaration, the act whereby the British government declared its support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Yet in the United States and France, today home to the world's two largest diaspora Jewish communities, a major shift toward acceptance of Zionism among the mainstream of the community did not begin until the mid-1940s during World War II. Indeed, until 1948, far more Jews worldwide were avid anti-Zionists than were actively Zionist. For decades, Reform Judaism took a hard line against Zionism. Reform leaders found the movement's particularism and nationalistic focus antithetical to core Reform commitments, like defining Judaism as a religion, seeing Judaism as a basis for universalism, and embracing Jewish acculturation in diaspora societies. The 1937 Columbus Platform marked a shift by seeing in the work of Zionism in Palestine, quote, "the promise of renewed life for many of our brethren," and in 1942, the Reform movement supported the formation of a Jewish army in Palestine. Even so, it was only in 1977 that the Reform movement sought to become an official Zionist-affiliated organization. Other manifestations of Jewish anti-Zionism also emerged, typically based upon a distinctive vision of Jewish politics, quite at odds with the assumptions of Zionism. Well into the post-World War II era, many leading European and American Jews, such as George Steiner and Hannah Arendt, embraced a secular version of the same points of emphasis as Reform Judaism. That is, on Jews as cosmopolitan, universalist, global, and defined by ethical values, and they maintained a wary posture toward the young Jewish state. From the late 19th to the mid-20th century, a variety of Jewish socialist organizations, particularly those connected to Yiddishism, took an entirely different diasporic approach from Zionism to both Jewish nationalism and Jewish socialism, and therefore opposed Zionism in a spirited battle for the hearts and minds of the Jewish masses in many countries and locales. As shown in Jeffrey Levin's recent book, Our Palestine Question, such political forces were part of a wider spectrum of Jewish critique of Israel in America in the 1950s and 1960s. Numerous Jews with deep ties to Israel and profound sympathy for Zionism raised fundamental issues that have remained taboo to this day and that have often been deemed not only anti-Zionist, but anti-Semitic in their implications. For instance, Don Peretz, the first Middle East expert on the staff of the American Jewish Committee, the AJC, became a leading expert on the Palestinian refugees of 1948 and drafted an initiative for aid to the refugees, briefly embraced by the AJC and announced in 1956 at its annual gala. In part because of the organization's focus on civil liberties and the way that the organization extended this to the new Jewish state, the AJC remained officially non-Zionist until 1967. To return for a moment to the issue of emotional registers that I noted earlier citing Derek Penslar's book, part of what is noticeable about many, if not most, of the foregoing examples is the way that they are animated by expressions of love and commitment, rather than anything like hatred toward Jews, Judaism, and Jewish culture. In more recent times, some movements highly critical of the situation in Israel that also spoke explicitly from a vantage point of love and commitment have been branded anti-Zionist by their opponents. Brera, a short-lived Zionist organization of the early 1970s, was among the earliest advocates for the creation of a Palestinian state alongside that of Israel. The group provoked fierce opposition from the Israeli government. More recently, J Street, founded in 2007 as a more left-wing, peace-oriented alternative to the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, has often branded itself pro-Israel and pro-peace. It has claimed that only by fighting for a two-state solution can Israel maintain its core democratic character and values. But despite such professions and the considerable number of rabbis, Jewish community professionals, and highly committed lay leaders involved with J Street, the organization has repeatedly been branded by critics as dangerously anti-Zionist and kept at a distance by the mainstream American Jewish community. On the whole, we can see that over a long historical arc, a number of Jewish organizations and Jewish community leaders have been vocally critical of the Zionist project, while avowing commitments to Jewish religion, culture, and people that make it difficult to reasonably call them anti-Semitic. Perhaps surprisingly, the same is true for many of the most visible Palestinian Arab critics of Zionism from the movement's very inception to the present. The earliest known expression of this kind of critical anti-Zionism comes in a famous letter from the accomplished Palestinian scholar and former mayor of Jerusalem, Yusuf Dia al-Din Pasha al-Khalidi, written to Theodor Herzl in 1899. Al-Khalidi wrote with great respect for Judaism and Jews, whose commonalities and connections to Muslims he highlighted. He condemned the persecution of Jews in Europe and expressed his understanding for the driving motivations behind Herzl's nascent movement. He declared that Zionism was, quote, natural, beautiful, and just, and exclaimed, quote, "Who could contest the right of the Jews to Palestine? My God, historically, it is your country." And yet, the, quote, brutal force of circumstances had to be taken into account, in particular that, quote, Palestine is an integral part of the Ottoman Empire, and more gravely, it is inhabited by others who would never assent to be overtaken by newcomers. On the whole, it was, quote, pure folly for Zionists to plan to take over the territory, and therefore, while nothing could be more just and equitable, he said, than for the happy Jewish nation to find refuge, it should be elsewhere. In the name of God, he pleaded, let Palestine be left alone. A decade later, as my colleague Jonathan Gribbetz, who I know spoke here a week ago, has detailed at a meeting in Jerusalem at the office of Eliezer ben Yehuda, who was the leading figure in the modern revival of the Hebrew language, there was a conversation of a similar tenor that unfolded between Ben Yehuda and Said al-Husseini and Muhammad Rui al-Khalidi, both recently elected representatives from the Jerusalem district to the Ottoman parliament. Both al-Husseini and al-Khalidi not only spoke warmly of Jews, but also extended a welcome to Jews who might come to Palestine. What worried them both, however, was the prospect of large-scale Jewish migration. Al-Husseini thought that though many more Jews could be accommodated, eventually the country's capacity would be reached and there would not be space for more Jewish immigrants. Al-Khalidi had moral objections based upon history to Jews returning to Palestine to claim it as their birthright from Arabs. Crucially, this conversation and the correspondence between al-Khalidi and Herzl occurred within the framework of Ottoman rule, at a time when it was not at all clear the empire would soon expire, or that the rise of individual nation-states in the Middle East was in the offing. So objecting to the Zionist project in this historical context hardly meant uniquely rejecting the right of Jews to self-determination. Equally importantly, the exchanges mentioned here were characterized by lively back-and-forth discussion, by a sense of critical inquiry and mutual respect between early Zionist leaders and leaders of the Palestinian Arab community. Now, lest we think that such engagement is simply a relic of the pre-state period, we can see major Palestinian thinkers of the late 20th and early 21st century who were both among Zionism's most important critics and offered explicit recognition of Jewish individual and national rights in Israel-Palestine. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus on just one striking example that may surprise many of you, and that is Edward Said. Said's book, The Question of Palestine, first published in 1979, has remained an urtext for anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian thought ever since, and particularly the essay that forms a chapter of the book entitled Zionism from the Standpoint of Its Victims. Said's basic starting point here was that Zionism had only been written about from the standpoint of Jewish history and not from that of, quote, the Palestinian, for whom Zionism has appeared to be an uncompromisingly exclusionary, discriminatory, colonialist praxis, close quote. Said pulled no punches, framing his critique of Zionism as part and parcel of his larger critique of Western Orientalism and Western colonialism, and insisting, quote, to write critically about Zionism in Palestine has never meant, and does not mean now, being anti-Semitic. At the same time, Said felt it urgent to write that no matter the importance of Zionism from the standpoint of its Palestinian victims, quote, it would be totally unjust to neglect the power of Zionism as an idea for Jews, or to minimize the complex internal debates characterizing Zionism, its true meaning, its messianic destiny, etc. Further, he added, I know, as well as any educated Western non-Jew can know, what anti-Semitism has meant for the Jews, especially in this century. Consequently, I can understand the intertwined terror and the exultation out of which Zionism has been nourished, and I think I can at least grasp the meaning of Israel for Jews. He even went so far as to say, quote, Zionism has had a large number of successes. There is no doubt in my mind, for example, that most Jews do regard Zionism and Israel as urgently important facts for Jewish life, particularly because of what happened to the Jews in this century. Then, too, Israel has some remarkable political and cultural achievements to its credit. When Said added a new preface for the 1992 edition of The Question of Palestine, writing in the shadow of the recent Madrid conference that had brought together Israeli and Palestinian negotiators and set the stage for the Oslo Accords, he had become, believe it or not, an avowed supporter of a two-state solution. He spent much of the preface praising the decision of the Palestinian leadership to come to the decision in 1988 to demand a state for Palestinians only in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Even in the late 1990s, when Said had long been frustrated with the Oslo peace process, and he wrote a notable piece in the New York Times calling for a one-state solution, he spoke of, quote, self-determination for both peoples, and floated the idea that in a single state, quote, each group would have the same right to practice communal life in its own Jewish or Palestinian way, perhaps in federated cantons, with a joint capital in Jerusalem, equal access to land, and inalienable secular and juridical rights. So we can see vividly here that Said was simply not the forerunner of negationist anti-Zionism that many of his most fervent acolytes and critics alike would currently have us believe. However fierce he was in his anti-Zionism, Said ends up recognizing many of the core tenets of Zionism regarding Jews' deep attachment to the land, their collective rights as a people, and the need for Jewish safety and security that Israel represents. In this, Said is hardly alone among major Palestinian intellectuals. Another significant example from our own time would be Rashid Khalidi, the world's leading scholar of Palestine and Palestinian nationalism. While his most recent book is fiercely critical of Zionism as a colonial project, in the conclusion, Khalidi declares that Palestinians, quote, must rid themselves of the delusion that Israel is not a real country. And he insists that the only solution to the conflict is equal individual and collective rights for both peoples. These examples put the lie to assumptions that sharp opposition to Zionism's actions on the ground or defense of Palestinian liberation must mean rejection of Israel's legitimacy. Now more than ever, many Jews and Arabs have found their voices silenced as, quote, anti-Zionist and inter alia anti-Semitic when their speech is harsh and derogatory toward Zionism or Israel, but lies firmly in this camp of critical anti-Zionism. And yet, anti-Zionism has historically and at present often ventured farther into more dangerous territory and meant something very different that I describe as negationist. That is a total rejection of the right of Jews to self-determination and an attack on the Jewish character of Zionism. This was present not only from Zionism's earliest days, but also among some of the most pioneering and influential anti-Semites in history. None other than Wilhelm Marr, who popularized the term anti-Semitism in 1879 as a political program in Germany, wrote at the time of the First Zionist Congress in 1897 that, quote, the entire matter is a foul Jewish swindle in order to divert the attention of the European peoples from the Jewish problem. Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg blamed World War I on the desire of Jews to obtain a state in Palestine, while also claiming that they were so incapable of statecraft that the future Jewish state there would in fact be, quote, a power base for Jews' global nefarious economic operation. Such examples, and there are many more that I could cite, indicate that from the earliest years of Zionism, many anti-Semites associated the movement with their long-standing stereotypes about Jewish power, greed, financial control, clannishness, disloyalty, or conspiracy. Simply put, Jews have been conditioned for more than a century to perceive anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism as part and parcel of the same body of perceptions and even political programs vis-a-vis Jews. This is even more so the case when we realize that many discourses in both Soviet and Palestinian Arab anti-Zionism, particularly from the 1960s onward, were not only unmistakably tinged with anti-Semitism, but they were often inseparable from it. Though Soviet anti-Zionism already began in the late 1940s, as my colleague Jim Leffler has traced, it was in the context of the Cold War and the rise of Third Worldism in the 1960s that the Soviets fashioned and disseminated a more distinctive, full-on ideology of anti-Zionism. As Israel became more tied to the US and West Germany, the USSR utilized the United Nations and international debates over racism, human rights, and international law as a venue in which to denounce Zionism as racism. Soviet spokesmen compared Zionism to Nazism, even as they denounced anti-Semitism. In 1964, for example, the Soviet representative to the UN delivered a speech that called upon the international community to take action that would lead to the, quote, speedy eradication of anti-Semitism, Zionism, Nazism, neo-Nazism, and all other forms of the policy and ideology of colonialism, national and race hatred, and exclusiveness. A long list. Following Israel's dramatic victory in the 1967 war and the country's occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula, this type of rhetoric grew more intense. In the years to come, the USSR regularly produced writings that claimed Zionism was the equivalent of, quote, genocide in Palestine, still emphasizing all the while the fight against, quote, the virus of anti-Semitism. Following the 1975 UN General Assembly resolution that infamously labeled Zionism as racism, Soviet propaganda would claim that Zionism's core principle was indeed racism. As Leffler notes, Soviet propaganda turned Zionism's original meaning as a movement of liberation from anti-Semitism on its head into a movement that allegedly mimicked and benefited from anti-Semitism. Moreover, in the hands of Soviet propagandists, Zionism and anti-Zionism moved from precise descriptions of specific movements into terms that held much broader signifying power for the radical left. Zionism was linked to globalization and American hegemony, and anti-Zionism represented their opponents. It's striking how strongly this process of inverting anti-Zionism's significance, broadening its international reach, and unmooring it from real events or people in the Middle East echoes with some discourses that we hear today. And I want to return here in part to distinctions that I made between intention and impact and underscore what I think is a crucial dichotomy of vantage point. There's an important difference between political ideologues, like the Soviets in the mid to late 20th century, and a certain number of current progressives who have no personal skin in the game and have not experienced personal or family suffering at the hands of Zionism, on the one hand, and Palestinians themselves on the other. No matter how strident some of the language of anti-Zionist negationism from some Palestinians, it's fundamental to recognize that their opposition to Zionism expresses in significant part the protest of a people who've suffered personally at the hands of the Israeli state for 75 years. Where you sit, as it were, not only defines where you stand, it also does much to determine its meaning. And indeed, during the same era that Soviet anti-Zionism developed and grew, a gradual radicalization of anti-Zionism also emerged in the writings and propaganda of many Palestinian nationalists. While the 1968 Charter of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, rejected all, quote, discrimination of race, color, language, or religion, it spoke of Zionism in terms that denied the movement's origins and validity and demonized its basic character. Now Zionism was described as, quote, racist and fanatic in its nature, aggressive expansionist and colonial in its aims, and fascist in its methods. Moreover, Judaism was described unequivocally as a, quote, religion, not an independent nationality. The charter called for the elimination of all Zionism and Zionists from the land of Israel-Palestine. The only Jews welcome to remain in the territory were those who had resided there before 1917, since they were, quote, considered Palestinians. This was, by implication, a call for the elimination of all but a handful of Jews from the land between the rivers and the sea. In 1988, the founding charter of Hamas would go much farther. It called for, quote, a struggle against the Jews and dubbed, quote, Israel, Jews, and Judaism as evil enemies of, quote, Islam and Muslim people. Furthermore, invoking classical anti-Semitic stereotypes, it said that, quote, with their money, these enemies had formed secret societies, controlled imperialistic countries, and been responsible for the world wars, among other calamities. The charter even cited the infamous anti-Semitic tract, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, as laying out an alleged plan for Zionist territorial expansion that knew no bounds. In 2017, Hamas issued a new set of, quote, principles and policies that pulled back from classic anti-Semitic language and restricted its critiques to Zionism. Still, it was unabashedly negationist, as it demonized Israel's existence, calling Zionism, quote, a racist, aggressive, colonial, and expansionist project based on seizing the properties of others. declaring that, quote, the Israeli entity is the plaything of the Zionist project and its base of aggression, it effectively still implied a Zionist world conspiracy. It also continued to claim that the Zionist project was against the will of not only the Palestinians, but the entire Islamic Ummah. References like this last one were part of a larger effort to cast anti-Zionism as fundamental to the struggle of radical Islam against the West, a schema that reaches well beyond Israel-Palestine, and in which conspiracy theories about Jews and Israel often play a central role. So we can see how, since the 1960s, many expressions of both Soviet and Palestinian Arab anti-Zionism grew increasingly harsh and even dehumanizing toward all attached to the Zionist project. In the case of the Soviets and some of their ideological descendants thereafter, anti-Zionism became divorced as well from the specifics of Israel-Palestine. What many Soviet and Palestinian nationalist anti-Zionists shared is that they took on a negationist logic that dismissed entirely the basic tenets of Zionism and claims to Jewish self-determination in some portion of historic Palestine. And they frequently embraced anti-Semitic stereotypes in order to mark their criticisms of Zionism, Israel, or Jews directly. So far, I've stepped back from contemporary polemics to see instead historical problems around the relationship between Zionism and colonialism, Jews and other others, and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I've traced two traditions or strands of anti-Zionism that I've called critical anti-Zionism and negationist anti-Zionism. And I've tried to show that each of these strands took particular forms in particular historical contexts, be they the founding of modern Zionism, the years of the British Mandate, the Cold War, or post-1967. What I want to suggest in this last section is that the events in Israel and Gaza since October 7th, the way they have upended our public discourse around Israel-Palestine, and now the measures underway from the Trump administration have raised dramatically the stakes of each of the polemics to which I refer, and have made it all the more crucial that we seek to restore a sense of historical perspective in lieu of such polemics. In short, the questions have come to be seen as carrying existential importance, both on the part of many Zionists and many anti-Zionists. Since the war began, a majority of Israelis have seen the need to fight back against Hamas as one that is existential. This is because of the genocidal intent articulated by Hamas before, on, and since October 7th, and the sense that on that day Israel lost its power of deterrence that is ultimately its only guarantor in a hostile neighborhood. For Palestinians, the experience of the war is equally existential. More than 50,000 Palestinians have died in Gaza. Much of the territory lays in total ruins, and for most Palestinians, it has seemed since not long after October 7th that they are living a second Nakba in real time. The discourses about the war, and more specifically about the meaning of anti-Zionism, have for many taken on a correspondingly existential significance. On my campus and many others, this process was particularly vivid at a series of rallies in the days, weeks, and months after the attack of October 7th. Placards and chants laid out slogans like, "There is only one solution, Intifada revolution. From the river to the sea, Palestine will all be free, and when a people is occupied, resistance is justified." Before October 7th, even if these slogans resonated in painful ways for many Jews, their meaning could be associated vaguely with Palestinian resistance to oppression, and thus, at least for some, a kind of critical anti-Zionism. Now, however, in the wake of the murderous attack of October 7th, these slogans could only be heard by many as justifications of the massacre and calls for further violence to come. They were literally heard by many Jewish students, as they told me, as shouts of "death to the Jews." And yet these were not the only students feeling threatened. Simultaneously across the United States, Palestinian protesters have very often faced assumptions that by their very nature, they are engaging not only in anti-Zionism, but also in anti-Semitism. On my campus and many others, Palestinian students have been doxxed, harassed, and threatened merely for making their voices heard, wearing keffiyehs, or holding Palestinian flags. Just as the spike in negationist anti-Zionism that occurred immediately following the attacks has been deeply dehumanizing toward Israelis and Jews, efforts to classify all pro-Palestinian speech as anti-Semitic and off-limits have in turn also been deeply dehumanizing. These two developments, where anti-Zionism seems urgently necessary to fight against an existential threat for one side, and where it seems like part of an existential attack on Israel's existence, its future, and its basic right to exist for the other side, made the debate more difficult than it has ever been. This is all the more so the case today as the measures and rhetoric of the Trump administration seek to eliminate any daylight at all between anti-Zionist expression and assumptions of anti-Semitism. In so doing, the administration threatens as well to pretend that there's no longer any distinction between intention and impact. So to conclude, historically, we've seen that anti-Zionism has been difficult to define and has had a complex and ever-shifting relationship to anti-Semitism. But if we want to move beyond the debates of the current moment, we would do well to think beyond polemics and take careful note of two broad strands of historic and contemporary anti-Zionism, which I've called critical and negationist. Since October 7th, and all the more so since January 20th of this year, I believe we've entered a new historical era where the stakes of debates over anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism have been ratcheted up exponentially. We might end with a few brief guidelines that do not tell you when to think that anti-Zionism definitively is or is not anti-Semitic, but that tell us, I think, the right questions to ask, which for administrators seeking to act with integrity today in the face of immense competing pressures seem to me more important than ever. In particular, in light of our foregoing discussion, it's best to examine the following. First, is the criticism of specific policies of Israel or of the right of Jews to their own state? Second, is the given anti-Zionist expression using symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism? Third, is the speaker offering a political program that would fundamentally change sovereignty and rights on the ground in Israel and Palestine? If so, is the given program one that upholds or rejects collective rights for Jews in some portion of the land? Fourth, does the given anti-Zionist expression demonize Zionism in Israel in a way that is dehumanizing or that distorts historical or contemporary reality? Fifth, is the expression of anti-Zionism blaming all Jews for the actions of the Israeli government or disqualifying a person because of an association with Israel? These return us to what has become a burning question for many today. When is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic? The answer must begin by defining our terms, by attending to context, and by asking the right questions. Thank you.
Testing. Oh, there we go. Thank you so much, Professor Katz, for that wonderful and thought-provoking lecture. We're going to turn it over to Q&A now. A brief reminder that a question, for the purposes of tonight, is going to be a short sentence ending in a question mark, so that we have time for our speaker to actually address them. And we're going to have microphones circulating around the room, so please just raise your hands, and we'll get to as many folks as we can.
And I'll just give the proviso that I always give, which is that I'm happy to answer any question. Just please be nice and respectful.
This is not working, so go. Can I grab another mic out of here?
Hello. First of all, thank you for an elucidating commentary. I appreciate that. My question is this. You look, if you take Khalidi and Said as an example, you accurately describe that in some ways they recognize the need for some kind of Zionist expression. But you see on Berkeley campus, on Northwestern campus, in their names, you see the rise of anti-Zionism that is clearly anti-Semitism. And the question becomes, how do we address this? Because, for 40 years I've been making annual pilgrimages through the Berkeley campus because I used to live there. And I'm scared to do it now.
Okay. So, first of all, you should not be scared to come to Berkeley. I walk around in my kippah there every day. I've never experienced anti-Semitism on campus. That doesn't mean there's not anti-Semitism there. I also run something called the Anti-Semitism Education Initiative at Berkeley that I founded 6 years ago, and we do a lot of work, and actually I think we've done a lot of good work. That's for another conversation, although maybe not. That is, in terms of the answers, I think we have to be addressing the situation head on. So 2 things we do at Berkeley. One is we do a lot of trainings. We do a lot of engagement with staff, administrators, students especially, and with senior administration. And we have integrated anti-Semitism education into the fabric of campus life in a way that it was not before. And that a lot of that process had already happened before October 7th in ways that have been helpful to us. We also have the largest Israel studies program in the country now, as you may know, and just teaching a lot of classes and doing a lot of programming on Israel, which is going to be there no matter what other programming people are doing, is crucial in terms of having a balanced intellectual life on these topics. We also now have a dialogue program, which brings together groups of students connected to Israel and Palestine. We ran it for the first time all year this year. We're going to expand it next year. And I think that that's crucial for education and for people learning how to listen and talk to each other. You know, you're right about what you said, that people invoke Said or Khalidi in ways that are incorrect, distorting, hateful, not what those authors would embrace. People also misquote and mischaracterize Jabotinsky all the time, right? I mean, so there's only so much that can be done. I think at the end of the day, education is really sort of the silver bullet, right? I mean, it's slow, it's, you know, it's not headline grabbing in a lot of cases. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. But we see when we can do it at the micro level that it can make a radical difference in terms of stretching and opening students' minds. And we just have to figure out how to do it, you know, better, broader.
Someone else going before me, or? Oh, you can go first.
Okay, I'll go first.
You have the mic first.
Okay. So your framework, I think, in my interpretation, a lot of what your concept of what Zionism and anti-Zionism is relies on the concept of self-determination and collective rights, which I've found to be a really tricky concept for a lot of scholarship. And I think national liberation is a little easier for us to understand because there's a particular historicity to that term in that moment. But what does self-determination as a concept in politics mean in your intellectual framework?
So self-determination, I actually think, is quite a bit older as a concept than national liberation. National liberation gets projected back onto movements historically, and I will freely admit there's an anachronistic quality to doing it for the Zionist movement, but it gets done for lots of movements because that's how we understand them today, right? Self-determination, there's sort of brewing about it in the 19th century, and it crystallizes for sort of a hot minute around the Treaty of Versailles and a lot of the interwar period, and it's supposed to mean at a basic level that a group that has a history as a collective with ties of origins, ties of culture, ties of language, affirmative sense of belonging, that they have some right to autonomy. Now, in that moment, right, there's the autonomous movement of Jewish nationalism, which is not a movement for an independent Jewish state. There are minority rights treaties signed in the aftermath of World War I that are supposed to guarantee Jews certain kinds of legal and cultural rights and autonomy in a variety of states in Eastern Europe. Almost none of those treaties are enforced, and in most of those countries, Jews are persecuted severely by the late 1930s. It's one of the reasons the autonomous movement ultimately fails, right? So another avenue for self-determination is some kind of a political state. It's crucial to recognize that what that was going to look like was actually very much up in the air for Zionists for decades, right? Dmitry Shumsky's written a terrific book called Beyond the Nation State, where he shows that Herzl and Pinsker and Ahad Ha'am and even Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion were not at all clear that they were advocating for a single Jewish state in the majority of the land for much of the time that they were engaged in Zionist politics. They were looking for some kind of an entity that would enable Jewish collective life and Jewish collective security. So it is a historically contingent idea, but the overwhelming outcome of those ideas in the 20th century was nation states. That's the reality. Could that ever change? There are many people who would say, I hope so. But the world in which we live remains a world of nation states. And in a world of nation states, I would argue that states don't have rights to exist. There is no body of international law that says they do. But if we believe that nation states are, generally speaking, enabled to continue to exist as sovereign nation states that define their own character, I don't see why Israel should be the exception to that. At the same time, we have a group of people, Palestinians, who have unquestionably been disenfranchised and also have the right to self-determination. And so some kind of a formula must be created that enables both people to have collective rights and security and individual equality in this land. Obviously, it's not very simple to figure out, which is why we're still arguing and debating it now.
Thank you, Professor Katz, very much for this talk. I really enjoyed it, and I found a lot of your points really compelling. My question is somewhat of a two-part question, and I wonder if you could comment on the tendency that we see, especially nowadays, for a lot of people to label certain Jewish groups, from leftist Jewish groups like JVP, all the way to ultra-Orthodox Neturei Karta and Satmar communities, as anti-Semitic based on their anti-Zionism. And so I wonder if you can comment on that tendency to see Jewish people themselves as hawkers of anti-Semitism. And then the sort of second part of that question is sort of based on that: do you see anti-Semitism, as itself, sort of overburdened as a term, and perhaps even, maybe to be provocative, kind of a useless term when thinking about these sets of issues? Is anti-Semitism even the right framework to be thinking about sort of anti-Jewish thought or sentiment?
Two very good questions. Okay, so for the first question, I would say sort of a question about the tendency to label some groups that are Jewish groups, whether on the far left or the far right, as anti-Semitic. I sort of say three basic things that are, I think, needed. One is, some sense that I tried to sketch here of history of deep battles in which Jews have engaged in all kinds of positions from affirmative Jewish perspectives. And so we should be, I think, much more careful and reluctant to label people as outside the tent, so to speak, right? Also, we have to engage with each other, right? The reality is that just like we have to engage across the divide of Israel-Palestine between Jews and Palestinians or Arabs, we have to also engage those Jews with whom we have very strong disagreements, who it is very easy to label in a certain box. Usually when we engage people, even people with whom we have the most vehement disagreements, we are reminded that they are people, right? We are reminded that even that person who I can't stand their opinion, they also have needs and challenges in their life. They also actually are trying to engage some of the same questions I am. I didn't really think about that. They're just doing it from a radically different perspective, and we understand each other better. The third thing, though, is I think we want to engage people in an honest conversation about reality. Calls for the elimination of the Israeli state. I know many, many Jews and non-Jews for whom that call is because they are very angry at the policies of Israel, and that anger and critique is legitimate, and it does not come from a place of hatred toward Jews. But the implications of such a political program are potentially catastrophic for the Jewish people. And it is important, I think, to push people to say, what do you think happens to Jews if Israel becomes a pure secular democratic state where there's no particular allowance for Jewish culture or no particular provisions for protecting certain Jewish rights? What do you think happens if we say, no, Israel, not legitimate, not a real state, can't exist as a state until the coming of the Messiah, right? To talk about people on the far right, right? And what would that mean for the Jews living there? The strongest political group within the Palestinian polity such as it exists remains Hamas, remains a group that calls for the destruction of all Jews in the land very openly. And for many Israelis, post-October 7th, the notion of a binational state even is far less palatable because basically what happened on October 7th was neighbors murdering neighbors in many ways, right? And so we have to realize, there's ideals, and there's ideals we can respect, there's intention, if you will, and then there's the potential impact. So I think we have to highlight the need for historicity, the need for person-to-person engagement, and also the need for realistic notions of what a political program, how it would play out. Anti-Semitism as a term, David Angle wrote a famous essay saying we should stop using the term. He clearly didn't persuade most people in the profession, or certainly not in the wider world. You know, it is an overburdened term, and I think we have to be precise about what we mean. When we talk about campus life and certain other social contexts, I think what matters most is, what is the climate like for Jews? What is the impact of certain kinds of expression, certain kinds of rhetoric, certain kinds of exclusion on Jews' capacity to live their fullest life as Jews? If we want to insist that something is anti-Zionism and not anti-Semitism, in my view, that does not inoculate it from potentially being very harmful, just as other kinds of discrimination against various nationalities or national movements can be, harmful and racist. So I don't think labeling things anti-Semitic is necessarily terribly helpful, and I think we've wasted a huge amount of time and energy debating definitions of anti-Semitism. I think thinking about what is the impact and how do we create a world in which Jews can live their fullest lives like everyone else is really where our focus has to be.
I'd like to ask a different kind of question. At Berkeley, in the past, were there Jewish speakers or Zionist Israeli speakers who came to speak and their speeches were not allowed to take place for one reason or another? And will that happen in the future?
Right, so it's a great question. With very rare exception, the answer is no. Right, so we bring dozens of speakers every year who speak about Israel, who speak about Zionism. As I mentioned, the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies is the largest Israel Studies program in the country. We bring 6 to 10 faculty a year who are visiting faculty from Israel. Their classes are never protested. The events the Diller Institute puts on are almost never protested. Jewish Studies, we put on events connected to Zionism in Israel. We basically never experience protests. Berkeley also very, very seldom shuts down an event. It only shuts down an event if it feels it has no choice. There was one event last year that was put on by a pro-Israel student group where they brought a speaker to campus. The speaker was provocative, but various speakers can be provocative. There was a very fierce protest. There was actually the very rare instance of violence where the building was stormed. That was terrible. It was denounced immediately by the administration, and the administration committed itself immediately to bringing the speaker back, which it did a few weeks later with more security. Right? So when a speaker has in any area has been protested in a way that kept the event from taking place, that event had to be shut down because of the violence. Berkeley has committed itself to bringing the speaker back in a way that can work. But really, that event is an extremely rare exception in all my time at Berkeley for an Israel-related event that has been shut down by protest.
Hey, thank you so much for your lecture. I found the part where you talked about intent versus impact very interesting, because, like, to the JVP question and the J Street question, you're kind of saying that within this one-state solution vision, the intent might be for freedom for all, but the impact might be that Israeli Jews get killed. And I think what's interesting for me is that the intent versus impact is completely flipped when it comes to Zionism. Like, the intent, as you correctly said, is about Jewish safety. It's about, the noble idea that Jews deserve to flourish. But the impact over the past however many decades has been that, like, after the Holocaust, more Jews have died in Israel than outside of Israel. That, the ICC has declared Israel, whatever, all the critiques that we see of Israel. And so my question for you is, how do you see this intent versus impact playing within Zionism and within the ways the intent might be safety, but the impact might not actually be?
Sure. Quick question. Did I hear you say JVP or J Street?
Both.
Yeah, so I want to make
and I know J Street, sorry, you're right.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick clarification that their positions are radically different, frankly. J Street basically is a liberal Zionist organization. JVP is avowedly anti-Zionist in their platform. So it's a good question. I would say a few things respectfully. I The impact of Zionism for Jewish history is in many ways unequivocally positive. Not in all respects, but it's the reclaiming of sovereignty for Jews for the first time in 2,000 years. It's the absolutely unprecedented flourishing of Jewish culture in terms of Jewish art, Jewish literature, various religious institutions. It's the building up of a whole new Jewish culture in Israel in which people can flourish in a whole range of ways. It's the restoration of Jewish pride for many people in the wake of the horrors of the Holocaust and centuries of anti-Semitism. There are other ways in which we can certainly critique its impact on Jewish thought and on sort of diaspora Jewish politics, and I don't want to ignore those. But I think it's important to be real about the very tangible, very important benefits for Jews that have come through Israel. So when we talk about intention and impact, depends partly on who we're talking about. I think the reality is that for the vast majority of Zionists, those have been the intentions, those have been the goals. The problem is, for many of them, the impact of Zionism on Palestinian Arabs has been something that they have considered either incidental or collateral damage or a price that had to be paid for the success of Zionism, right? And so I think we have to acknowledge that. I mean, and we have to just be honest about it. I think we also have to recognize there's not a single national liberation movement in the history of the planet that has been triumphant, that hasn't done significant violence and created exclusionary mechanisms. And that's not to excuse Israel's crimes or crimes of Zionism, but it's to be real about not sort of singling out and pretending that Zionism is this singular case of contradiction between liberation on the one hand and suffering and persecution on the other hand, right? So now Zionism has to reckon with that. I mean, Israel has to reckon with that. Israel has to find a path forward that can entail, defending many of its achievements and many of its positive elements and providing real space for Palestinian liberation, Palestinian justice. And that probably has to include also greater thought about the national character just of Israel itself, in terms of the fact that a quarter of its population now are Palestinian Israelis, right? And figuring out how you can maintain a Jewish character to the state and Jewish national symbols and do all that without, you have to find some way to signal to a quarter of your population that they also fully belong when they're not Jewish. And that's not simple. But I think that's also unlikely to be settled before the larger conflict is settled.
When did the term Palestinian first arise? What does it mean to be a Palestinian? And how do you qualify?
Well, the term Palestinian was used certainly in the interwar years by a number of Jews in Palestine to talk about themselves. There's good work that shows the ways that many of the roots of Palestinian identity emerged in the 19th century in terms of attachment to specific places and specific sense of culture and place-based Arab identity beyond just pan-Arab identity. It's clear that Palestinian nationalism became strengthened significantly in a dialectic to the emergence and growth of Zionism and Zionist settlement in the land, right? I don't think that, I don't want to misread your question, so forgive me if I am. I don't think that we gain anything either on a basis of sort of good faith interchanges and ethical basis for a Jewish state, or on the basis of strategy by trying to deny Palestinian peoplehood. Palestinians have a long-standing shared history with elements of shared culture in the same place. They identify very strongly with that place. They have for more than a century. They have identified themselves as Palestinian explicitly for 60, 70 years, depending on who and where. And so since we're not generally in the business of going around the world and judging the validity of nationalist claims based upon how recent they are, or how recent the terminology connected to them is, I don't think we should do that for the Palestinians either.
I'm curious what the next slide would be. And I know there's a deck and there is actually a next slide, but I'm curious, there's like a so what question to, okay, so I determined that the criticism is anti-Semitic, or do I call it out? Do I cancel? Do I engage? What are your suggestions for the next slide?
Right. Great question. Thank you, Michael. So, I mean, I think, look, I really think the reality is that most of these issues need to be mediated through a lens of, at least in the first instance, education, right? We tend to have a punitive instinct when we think something wrong has been done. We all have it. I have it, my children have it, my students have it, I get it. But the reality is that unless we are really confident that the perpetrator knows what they're doing and they violated clear rules, punitive solutions are usually not successful. And our goal, overwhelmingly, at the end of the day, is that many more people will understand what anti-Semitism is. They will refrain from saying anti-Semitic things. They will make the environment more of an environment where Jews can thrive. They will have greater understanding and allyship with Jews when they face anti-Semitism, right? So the question of how we get there, I think, this is a good way for us to start to think about the question, but I would actually argue it's usually a good way for us to start a conversation. We need to have skilled educators. We sometimes need to have skilled mediators who can sit with the person who has done something that maybe, and sometimes we might even say, you know what, this probably wasn't anti-Semitic, but it still was really offensive, and these people had a reason to be offended. And so we need to sit together and we need to talk about, why was this really offensive for me? Why did this person say this, right? I mean, I'll give a concrete example, right? There's an event that is taking place on the Berkeley campus, sometimes called an Intifada Gala. Okay. Right, yes. I know, okay. So students came to me and they said, there's this Intifada Gala is happening. This is horrible, we're super upset. Can't we do something? And I said, well, in terms of the freedom that student groups have, we probably can't shut the event down. I said, what I think you can do is push really hard for you to have the opportunity to have a conversation in which you explain why this is so offensive to you and why the word Intifada for you represents horrible, murderous violence targeting Jews. And you should realize, I said to them, that when you have that conversation, some of the organizers are probably going to say the word Intifada in Arabic simply means rising up. It means resistance. And for us, we are not thinking of this event in those terms. And then you can have a conversation. And you know what? At the end of the day, they will still have the right to hold the event, but at minimum, they will understand and they will have to own the fact they're doing something that is offending many Jewish students. And some of you may come out of there not feeling so yucky about the event, understanding more what it means for many of those students, right? I think we need to have like thousands of those conversations on our campuses happening, and we don't have the tools to do it in the widespread way we need to, and we don't have the will of enough administrators to basically do all they can to force students to be in that room together and have those conversations. But I think if we're going to move the needle, then these questions are a starting point. They're helpful for those conversations, but we have to have widespread engagement. When people break rules and they break clear rules and they've been warned about those rules and their intent is demonstratively to make Jewish or Zionist students feel that they don't belong somewhere, that's a different story, and rules have to be enforced.
So because our time is short, I'm going to steal Professor Katz's thunder from that last comment and say that apropos the importance of education for treating these kinds of issues, I hope that we'll have a chance to see all of you at future events like this one here at Northwestern, where we're trying to do exactly this kind of work, but we couldn't do it better than we've heard tonight from Professor Katz, so thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. You've been a great audience.